Okay, welcome to the class. Our second podcast, live streaming podcast here. Today's topic is going to be about women and Minyan. Popular topic, I'm sure. Will be very interesting, I hope, anyway. I found it interesting as I was researching it. Before we do that, though, I want to go back and just comment very briefly on something that we talked about last week. We were discussing women in the shul, in particular, as it applies to mechitza and separation of men and women in the shul. And I think it was Leah Ridd who had mentioned the case. We had talked about how the shul in Judaism is not the center of religious life, even though it seems to be, and that we get that idea not really so much from the Jewish values and laws, because there's no law about shul in the Torah itself. There's no mitzvah to have a shul per se. There's no such thing in the Torah, and we're talking about how the primacy of the primacy of the shul is really not a Jewish idea. So insofar as we consider the home to be the center of Jewish values, education, transmission, and practice. And Leah had mentioned, we talked about the holiness of the shul and how the laws that pertain to how we're supposed to act in shul derive from the holiness of the place. We talked about what the holiness of a shul is and where it gets that status. And Leah had mentioned that she had asked Rabbi Lindau at the Torah Center about children playing in the shul near the bima, not during services but after services, and he had mentioned that because the Torah Center was originally set up with other purposes for that room in mind, that it's a meeting room, it's an eating room, it's a lecture room, it's a playing room for the kids. Therefore, that because it started out with a dual purpose, it doesn't have the same level of holiness as a shul that is set up with only the purpose of davening in it. And I wasn't as clear that is absolutely correct. And I wanted to just confirm that view is correct. So much so that, according to my husband, he believes that there are very few shuls today that are actually set up with that sole purpose of having a one-purpose room of just davening. Even HOC, I believe, is set up so that there are lectures given in the shul itself. Once you say this shul is going to be, we're going to be able to do these other things in it, then it does have a diminished status in terms of holiness of the space. That's not to say that wherever men gather together to daven, or men and women gather together to daven, there isn't a certain holiness. As I mentioned last week, you can get together in a wedding hall, and go off to the side of the room and make a minyan, and therefore that group is now coming together in a holy way to pray, and that area has a holy status, but it certainly does not have the same status as a shul that is set aside just for that purpose. So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay. So today we're going to talk about, as I said, women in Minyan. I want to first give a little bit of a schmooze here on a concept that I think that is related to the idea of women and the mitzvos. Okay, and I think will help us understand greatly the differences in perspective that women may have when we approach the mitzvos and see them in a certain way. So women today have been raised on the belief of equal rights, rightly so. Right? In secular life, we focus on women, equality in the workplace and equality on campuses, equality of pay, and those are all very appropriate things to be struggling for, the struggle for equal rights. That's fine. The underpinning of this struggle, the philosophical underpinning of the struggle, is the philosophy of democracy, right? That we're all equal under the law. Okay. And so when women then turn to Judaism and they see inequalities, what they view as inequalities, they see differences. They see a woman cannot join a minyan. A woman cannot, get an aliyah, for example. There's certain things a woman isn't able to do that a man can do, and it's seen as not fair, just not fair. So therefore, because they're looking at the idea of equality equals sameness, they say that's just not fair. If I'm entitled to the pursuit of happiness in the secular world, then I should be entitled to pray the way I want to in the Jewish world. Okay, so we're applying a perspective that comes from a little bit of a different place. It's a different philosophy. The basics, however, the basic philosophy of Jewish law does not speak in terms of rights at all. So it's an interesting idea to think about. We don't nowhere in the Torah, except for legal situations, for example, the rights of a woman in a marriage, the rights of a husband in a marriage. We don't speak when it comes to mitzvos, commandments. We do not speak in terms of rights. There's no such thing as, you'll never see it said that a man has a right to go to shul or the man has a right to be in a minyan. And similarly, you'll never see it said a woman doesn't have the right to be in a minyan. Okay, it's always articulated in terms of obligations. So a man has an obligation to be in a minyan. A woman does not have the obligation to be in a minyan. And that basically forms the basis of the logic of why a woman is not in a minyan. We'll talk about that more later. So that's the issue. It's not about obligations. It's a different perspective. It's a matter of a difference of looking at things as entitlements versus duties. Right? So, for example, in Jewish law, in the Jewish world, we will have a duty, an obligation to teach Torah and to learn Torah. But there's no such thing as a right to an education. So we don't speak in those terms, right? Another example, we have the obligation to feed the poor and to clothe the poor and to provide for them. And so from that we learn that there is an inherent right that a human being would have to a livelihood and to be to have dignity and to have their needs fulfilled. But it's understood in terms of what I'm obligated to do for that person, not in terms of what I'm entitled to as that poor person. Okay, and the issue of choice comes into play only in terms of whether or not I will fulfill that obligation. All right, so back to your question, Lisa, from last week, because it was bothering me. I was thinking about it. You made the point. You said, if it's a man's obligation to focus on his prayers, and if he should not be distracted from his prayers, why do I have to be shut away? Why is it my responsibility to shut myself away? It's his responsibility to focus. Okay, so the answer to that is yes, it's both. Okay, because again, we don't talk in terms of rights. We don't say a man doesn't have a right not to be distracted. Sorry, a man doesn't have a right not to be distracted by a woman. There's no right that says, right, I have to push you away because I have a right not to be distracted. But at the same time, we would say that a woman doesn't have a right to push herself in his face when he's trying to pray, or to be next to him when he's trying to pray. Okay, so again, and this connects to the example I gave you last week was the McDonald's situation. If I see you go into McDonald's, right, I'm supposed to think well of you. In other words, I'm supposed to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume you're going in for a coffee. And at the same time, you have an obligation to try not to go in to McDonald's because you don't want to cause me to sin and think badly of you. So, in other words, in that situation where there's a possibility of a sin to be committed, right? The sin being that I will think Lisa did a sin. That's a sin itself, right? In other words, if I think that Lisa committed a sin, that's a bad thing. I'm not supposed to think that way. I'm supposed to give her the benefit of the doubt. In that situation, it's both of our obligations to avoid that situation. So my obligation is, if I see her go in, I need to give her the benefit of the doubt. Be done l'kaf and think, oh, I'm sure she's just going in for a coffee. At the same time, Lisa is responsible for me. She is obligated, right, to make sure that she doesn't put a stumbling block in front of me. What that means is that there's a mitzvah in the Torah, Lifnei iver lo sitein michshal. In front of a blind person, don't put a stumbling block. Right? If someone is blind, literally what this means is don't put something in someone's way if they're not going to see it there. What the rabbis understand from this text, the verse, is that you should not help a person to sin. So the example from the Talmud is, if there's a Nazirite who has sworn off drinking, don't give him a cup of wine. Okay? And in a modern day application, if my husband is on a diet, I will not bake a chocolate cake that week. Don't enable, in our modern psychological terminology, don't be an enabler. Okay? And so, that's the idea of, if you think you'll do something that might cause me to sin, then you have a responsibility towards that as well. So going back to the men and the women issue, yes, it's the men's obligation to focus, and it's the women's obligation to help them focus. There's no concept of I have a right. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the topic of women in shul and we'll see how that plays out. Yes, Alice.
Am I allowed to add to this?
Absolutely.
It's interesting in our American system. There is a sense of community and nation, but as you're talking, I'm realizing there's a lot of emphasis on the individual's rights to pursue this and that in an autonomous way. However, in Judaism, the weight is towards the community. As I'm hearing you talk, that value is more emphasized. That we're all trying to help each other through these duties and obligations, create a holy community.
Correct.
And so that's another difference. Not only the rights versus obligations, but the individual versus the community. So they're sort of different goals, and I think that's where, I'm just agreeing with you that I think the feminists fall down in that way, and when we read it is because the goals are different. And, our goal is holiness, and their goal is more of a utopian, secular, political system, which isn't wrong or bad.
Right.
It's just different, and you can't reach the same goals through the same path, through the same.
Absolutely, and I'll talk more about that later. But I also want to add something to that. Connected to what you're saying is the quote that I gave you last week, which is Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lazeh. Each person in the nation of Israel is responsible for the other. And that is in the American secular system, it's a little bit disturbing, the idea that I'm responsible for you not to sin, but it does draw a tremendous closeness in terms of community. It delineates that we are one unit. It's many times we talk about being a family unit, and that's more of the way you would think about a family. You don't want your child, you try not to get your child, and you hope your husband, that you try to help each other in a very close way. It's funny you mentioned that in Israel, if anyone's been to Israel, there's socially it's a very different world, because based on this idea that we're one family, if a child acts up in public, very often you'll see, I don't know if it's still the case, I know it was true when I went, you'll see, very often strangers disciplining that child as like almost like an aunt would do, and in America that would be, absolutely, for nobody would dare speak up. But in Israel, and it comes again from the sense of being a unit, a family unit, you'll see very often people, just, hey, what's wrong? You be quiet, And then, and it's not, the parent doesn't take it as an insult. The parent takes it as quite par for the course, that a stranger is going to help me raise my child. What do you want to say, Barbara? Okay, yes.
When I went to Israel in 1994 and 95, I was amazed by what you're calling the connections. That is to say, there's more interaction between people than here. If you're in an elevator, people are talking to you, and if you're on the bus, some people engage you in a conversation, and
Right,
and
right.
and in Hebrew, and whether or not you understand is one thing, but it's like people are always kind of connecting to each other in whatever context they find
Yeah,
themselves.
it's true. So there is this different concept in our world that we're one unit, and that we do have to act together and think about the other person. And it makes you, as I was saying last week about my other class on interpersonal relationships, it heightens the awareness that you have to be so sensitive. It heightens your that sensitivity level, because I have to constantly be aware of how my actions, my speech, even my thoughts are going to be affecting my neighbor, who is tied up with me in a very close way, not only familially and genealogically speaking, but in this quest for holiness, as you mentioned. Okay, so yeah,
I'm just wondering, so why do we not go around rebuking each other?
we should. There's a mitzvah to do so. Mitzvah from the Torah.
It'd be a very different
Miriam's smiling because
community if-
we've dealt with this mitzvah in our other class. There is a mitzvah to rebuke your neighbor. Absolutely. The reason that we don't do it is a couple of reasons. First of all, because it has to be done in the proper way. It has to be done the proper way. It has to be done with loving kindness. It has to be done with the right intentions. If I'm gonna go around thinking, I got to correct her behavior. I got to correct her behavior. That's not what we call the Shema. That's not really for the sake of the mitzvah. It's because I got some agenda here. So it's rare to have that situation where you see someone and really you see someone doing something wrong, and really out of love of this person, love of Hashem, and love of the mitzvah, I'm going to correct his behavior. I'm going to say something to that person. It's rare to have that situation to begin with. But then you have to do it in the proper way. You have to do it in private. You have to do it quietly. You have to do it also knowing whether or not that person is going to accept your rebuke. Because if you know the person, or if you suspect the person is not going to accept that rebuke, then you really are not allowed to say anything. In other words, if you think the person's going to get angry at you or not care and do it anyway, if you think it won't help, there are parameters in terms of how to do it that really limit our ability to do that. That's the basic. You want to add something to that, Miriam?
It's very challenging to do, because in America we're taught, don't, particularly in the Midwest, don't criticize people, don't. But if no, there are so many mitzvahs and halakhas. If nobody ever corrected anybody else, we the Jewish people would be kind of more. But it is very challenging.
It is challenging. That's why I think people don't, do it on a regular basis. But absolutely, if you see somebody doing something that is not correct, it is a mitzvah, it's a commandment for you to help that person be better. Yeah, instruct him. Maybe he or she doesn't know what it is they're doing wrong and would love the opportunity to learn more. It's the rare person, however, who can listen to criticism and be totally objective in that way, because we take things personally. That's just human nature. Yeah.
I had a thought. If you were in the workplace and there was a person and they repeatedly did something that affected it made the boss think less of them. Either they were always a few minutes late, or they took too many supplies, or they were chatting too much with workers or whatever. And you cared enough about this person that you didn't want them to be, their status with the boss to go down, wouldn't you try to say something? And our boss is Hashem. So if somebody is doing something that might lower their status or merits in Hashem's eyes, maybe it relates.
Right. Okay. Yes.
I have one more comment too, which is if you're brought up in a culture that proposes that, then you are more susceptible, or it's easier for you to accept criticism. Mm-hmm. or to give criticism. I mean, I would say gentle criticism, right. Because it's not an affront. It's not a denial of the self. It's not punishment. It's the way things are, the way things should go. And so the child learns that, and as the child grows up, I think that interaction becomes easier.
Yes.
Oh, I heard a rabbi talk on this subject, and for me, what my takeaway message from it was, if you're going to rebuke someone, you have to do it in a way which brings them closer.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to rebuke in a way which is pushing them away,
Then you don't do it. Right.
And I thought, okay, that really makes it clear. And I just, what you were talking about, Israel, when I was in Israel, I would be rebuked even if I was an adult.
Really?
And not in a bad way,
Right.
but, I was at this, well, everybody thinks, they're all in your business.
Sure.
You're all friends, and,
Right.
you're all family,
Right,
right?
right,
So it's
right.
like my friends were davening at, I guess, King David's tomb, and I was standing outside because, well, they were davened a long time because they knew Hebrew, they knew what to do, and I was just like a beginner, and I did what I could, and then I went outside, and this guy comes up and says, "You're not davening?" I said,
You're not davening?
I was in there davening, he says, "And you're through already?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I got through, my friends are still in there."
That's funny.
So, but because it's what you were saying, that it was for the good of the whole. We have a mission, and you should be doing your part, and I took it in that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Even in a movie theater, and a movie is going on, I don't know the person next to me, but the person next to me in Israel would start talking to me about the movie. Do you see that? Do you believe that? Do you da da da? And
Right. That's funny. What you said about mission, that we all have a part in the mission, connects back to this idea of men and women, because when we understand, we talked a lot about different roles, and that difference doesn't necessarily mean unequal, but that we accept that there are different roles throughout the Jewish family. So that if you think about it as a family, where a father has a role, a mother has a role, they might be, the mother's role to go out and work and the father's role to nurture, that's fine, but there's a role, there are different roles. And the child has a role, and the sibling has a role to the sibling has a different role. So there are, different parts of that family, but they all interact, work together, and form a unit. And if we think about the nation of Israel, our brothers and sisters as a unit like that, as a family unit, again, understanding that we all have different roles makes us understand that we're not diminished because we have a different role to play. And again, with the idea that the end goal is the holiness of the nation and infusing holiness into our lives, then again we can better appreciate this idea that, it's okay that I have a different place in the shul. All right, I'll talk more about this. Let's now actually begin our discussion about Minyan. So, so Minyan means literally maneh, comes from the root maneh, which means to count or to number. Okay, and a minyan is a group of at least 10 men who are equally obligated to public prayer. Now I say that because there are some men who are not obligated to public prayer. I will discuss that later. So a minyan is a group of at least 10 men that are obligated to public prayer. Now a woman will say, all right, why can't I be part of a minyan? Okay, it's another seeming example of the excluding women from a male thing and proof of their second-class status. Okay. Now, from a halachic standpoint, it's a very simple answer, which I'm going to explain in depth secondarily. But before I get to the halachic reason, very simple halachic logical reason, I'm going to discuss a philosophical reason behind minyan and why women are not included in the minyan. Okay, so the philosophical origin of minyan is based on the incident of the spies in the desert. So to refresh your memories about that, the Jews approached Moshe and said, "We are not happy." As usual, they approached him and said, "We're not happy." They had done this many times before. They were going to do it many times again. They were a little nervous. God had promised them that they would be led to the land of Israel, but then They're like, something doesn't sit well here. I've spent hundreds of years as a slave in Egypt, and now I'm in the desert, and now God is telling me I'm going to conquer the land of Israel? I'm not a warrior. What do I know about conquering a land? They were nervous. Now God had promised them, don't worry. He had seen the miracles he did. They had seen all the miracles that he did in taking them out, but they were still nervous, right? Okay, this was the men talking. They said, let's send spies, listen to Moshe, let's send spies to the land. Let's do a little scout, a little reconnaissance visit. Let's scout the land and see what we're up against. It'll make us feel better. When Moshe approached Hashem, God, with this, interesting, very interesting, God said to Moshe, send men if you want to. Right? One of the major commenters on the Torah text, Kli Yakar, says that what he meant was, what God meant to say was, send men if you want to, but it would be better in my eyes, God's eyes, if you sent women. Because women trust me, and women love the land. They have no doubts that I'm going to do what I promised. Now, this connects back to this is just another proof, right? We talked about this as another example of how women in the era of Egypt, of Egyptian slavery, and in the era of the desert, the women of the desert, proved time and time again that they had a superior level of trust in God than the men. Remember the Egel Hazahab, the golden calf. They had nothing to do with it. Their husbands came to them and said, give us your jewelry. They said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with this. Like we talked about Miriam. Remember that when the women, when they had passed through the Reed Sea, God had saved them and crashed the sea down on their enemies, Miriam got up with a tambourine and started to sing praises to God. And the question the commentators say is, where did she get that tambourine from? What, when they were packing to leave, Egypt, they said, oh, let's not forget our musical instruments. Doesn't sound too logical. But the point was that they had such trust that God would in the future do miracles to save them, that they had the foresight to bring their instruments so that they would be able to praise him, right? So again, another example of their high level of trust. Okay, we had also the story of the women with the mirrors. They brought the mirrors as a donation for to be used in the tabernacle, and Moshe at first didn't want to use them because he felt it was a physical item. He didn't think it was appropriate to use such an object of vanity in a holy tabernacle. And God said, these mirrors are holy to me because they were used in the proper way. They were used for a holy purpose, to seduce their husbands in Egypt in order to grow the nation of Israel. And so we see time and time again, and in fact, that I mentioned to you that the laver, which is what the mirrors were made into, the washstand that the priests would wash in, that was that there were no dimensions given for the size or how big it had to be, because God said every single mirror that's brought has to fit into it. So however big that would grow to be is how big it's going to be. That's how dear those mirrors were to him. So we see time and again that women in the desert had a level of trust the men just didn't have. So women had absolutely nothing to do with the spies. In other words, the desire to send spies to begin with. So the 12 spies went into Israel. They came back with an evil report. They slanted the truth a little bit. They said, we can't do this. Right? The men believed them, and the women did not. Again, in a typical women trusting fashion here. They didn't believe them. Okay? The result of this sin was that all the men between certain ages of that generation died in the desert. They didn't make it to see the land of Israel. Not one woman died. Okay, so again, the women were the ones who showed the strength. In addition, of course, this delayed the entry of the Jews into the land of Israel by 39 years. This was the result of them wandering for another 39 years. They were supposed to go right in, from Egypt, right into the land of Israel. Okay. Through this incident, it was concluded that male Jews showed themselves deficient in trust of God, in their ability to worship God. Because what happened when they convened as a group is that they acted evilly. To rectify this, the Jewish leaders wanted to train the men that they need to convene as a group only for holy purposes. And therefore, they established that when they gather to praise God, they would have to do it in groups of 10, because it was 10 men who distrusted. 10 men gathered together and said, basically, we're not trusting God, and they gathered together for an evil purpose. Therefore, only by gathering in a group of 10 would they be worthy of correcting their original mistake. Okay? The women had nothing to do with it. They didn't sin in this sin. They didn't gather together to do evil, right? Just as in the other examples, they proved that they trusted God. They didn't die in the desert. Therefore, there was no reason to decree on them that they had to join a minyan of 10 in order to gain a status, regain a holy status, right? Basically, it's God's way of acknowledging that there's nothing inherently lacking in a woman to communicate with God without anybody else's help. That's basically what it is. Since they weren't involved in the original mistake, so at a mystical, Kabbalistic level, they are not responsible for the tikkun, for the repair of this mistake. All right? So, again, they retained their original status. Now, originally, men and women had the original status of being able to pray to God one-on-one, as the patriarchs and matriarchs did. Okay? The men had this status. Right? The Talmud says that all people were created from one original person, Adam, Harishon, the first man, first person, to emphasize the importance of each individual person being a world unto themselves. So there's a sense that I have a weight on my shoulders of the world. I am responsible for the world itself, which means that on the one hand I can do amazing things. And on the other hand, I have a weight on my shoulders of acting responsibly. Men had that status taken away with this, right? Women did not. Minyan tells a man, you're no longer able to meet God on your own merits. You now need other men around you to strengthen each other. Okay? A woman retains, however, that original status, so she doesn't need Minyan. So if Hashem says, you can say it out loud. You can say it out loud. So if Hashem tells us, Chaya, you have enough merits for God to hear you on your own, why should I insist that he only hear me in a group? Okay? Different perspective on the whole idea of Minyan. Right. So far from it being a sign of men's superiority to women, that they get together in a minyan, it's exactly the opposite.
It's like the ultimate example in parenting of logical consequences. That Hashem gave men a logical consequence for their
right.
actions.
Correct. And by the way, it's an example of also another very foreign idea to us, but one we see constantly in the Torah, that children pay for their parents' mistakes. Mm-hmm. We do. We're still paying for the mistakes that our ancestors made in the desert.
And it goes back to your original point about, and probably the point of your whole lecture about thinking about it as a right versus an obligation.
Correct.
That we're kind of people that are saying, oh, I want to be in a minyan, I don't count, that's not unfair, that's sexist.
Right.
Need to just flip their verbiage. Think
Correct.
about it in terms of an obligation.
Correct.
Why would I want an extra obligation?
Right. I like to give an analogy, and I actually wrote about this in an article for the paper, for the MTC. Here's an analogy. You're in a workplace environment. The boss decides the men are, I don't know, let's say being sexist pigs, which, okay, no comment. Okay, and the boss decides, you know what, I want to help my men be better men. So he makes a new program called the anti-sexual harassment program at work, and he makes a new requirement that he's going to have every week. He's going to have a program. The men are going to watch a film, and there will be sensitivity training. And he says, I need to have at least 10 men in this group every week. All right? So every week, 10 men have to go to this program, see this film, and be told what rotten people they are. Imagine a woman saying, it's not fair. I want to join that group. I want to be one of those 10. Okay? It's a little bit, that's, you know, it's what do you mean you want to be, you don't have this issue. You know, it's a corrective for men because they have a special issue. You don't have this issue. You're not sexist. You know, plus if you want to be the 10th person, right? The boss is requiring at least 10 in this group. You want to be the 10th person. That means that some other guy who really should join in this group is not going to have the chance. You're taking his place. Right? You're going to watch this film instead of him. He's going to say, great, I don't have to go. I've got 10. They've got 10. They don't need me. Right? Right? So they will be left out, and you're not giving that man a chance to grow. So that's the analogy I like to give. In fact, by the way, in egalitarian minyanim, in conservative and reform minyanim, where women are considered a part of the minyan, my husband and I have this actual personal experience of seeing that what happens very often is men stop showing up. So the very purpose of getting men to do more mitzvos, which we talked about, that they need more mitzvos, getting men to come to shul and pray and daven certain things that they can't without a minyan, that is lost because the women will show up and the men will not show up. And actually, I heard about a priest who actually had a similar positive reaction to the idea of minyan. He said, that's brilliant, man, that's brilliant. He said, my pews are full of women. I've been trying to think for decades, how do I get the men there? You know, so, you know, similar kind of idea. You want to say something?
But 10's the minimum.
10's the minimum.
But people feel like, oh, they got it covered, so I don't need to go.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Absolutely. That's exactly what happens. Yeah.
I'm also wondering if the women in these egalitarian minions feel obligated, or they just go, oh, now I can go if I want to.
Absolutely. You said the perfect thing, because this is something that my husband and I talk about very often. His thing is that, you know, you can talk about rights all you want to. If you look at it as a right and not as an obligation, then I can go when I want to. He says, you know, in minyanim, in egalitarian minyanim where women are counted, do they come on a regular basis? Mm-hmm. You know, do they come every day like they're supposed to? But no, because they're not viewing it as an obligation. They're viewing it as a right, which means I have a choice whether or not to do it. Mm-hmm. And that's not how we view mitzvos. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Another thing that I think, well, I could be wrong, but my sense is that, you know, women want to do all the things men can do. However, they don't want the men to be able to do what they do. So what's yours is mine, and what's mine is mine. It's like, I get to light the Shabbos candles. I get to do this, I get to do that, and I get to do what you do.
Right. That's true. I think that one of the beauties of the system, the Jewish system, the Torah system, is that we have this valuation of, you know, female traditions, female strengths, and male strengths and male traditions, and in this idea, again, it comes back to the idea of separate but equal. Secular feminism is beginning to come around to this, to our way of to finally seeing the light, as it were, in terms of there's a new wave of feminism that looks at the value of women's ways of thinking, women's ways of speaking, and women's traditions as having inherent value in themselves, which again, it's catching up with us. Mm-hmm. Catching up. We've always had that. We've always had the positive, you know, way of looking at it, mm-hmm. With that women have strengths, and that the mitzvot speak to those strengths, and those are different, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, so back to the issue. So now we're seeing that minyan is not a matter of it's valuable to men because it's a visible issue or a power issue. It's not that it gives importance to men. It's simply the restriction, simply the obligation that they have, right, to come to create an environment where they are sanctifying God's name in the proper manner. All right? It bears repeating, by the way, public is not better than private. Okay, because one of the beefs that a woman can have with it is that I have to pray privately, or I don't have to pray privately. You can join the Minyan too, but my prayer is valued in a private way, and men's prayer is valued in a public way. That's true, but to Judaism, public and private do not have lesser or higher statuses. Okay, there are times that we pray in private, and there are times we pray in public, and in fact, there are even times that woman is considered to be part of a public group, which I'll discuss later. She can be part of a minyan in certain situations. I'll discuss that later on. So again, equality to a secular woman is measured in terms of power and visibility. We don't measure, and those are played out in the arenas of profession and money and politics, which are legitimate areas of concern in the secular world. But in Judaism, the issue of equality in the workplace is just such a non-issue for us. Equality to us is a question on spiritual level. Am I equal in God's eyes? Do I have the same level of holiness? That's all that we care about. We talk about equality. Am I equal to my husband? In terms of what? In terms of that he is the one that has the public role in shul? That's not where it matters. Where it matters is, does God view me as important as my husband? Of course. We have the same level of equality in terms of holiness. So, aside from touching on issues of modesty, there's no such concept that we have that restricts a woman to the home, versus the workplace, right? As a secular concern of feminists, fine, let a woman go out to work. The poem that we read Friday nights, A Woman of Valor, right? It recounts all the praiseworthy aspects of a wife, and so many of them have to do with her business acumen. She plants vineyards. She goes and buys a field. She makes linens and sells them. She's a businesswoman, right? If you look around the Orthodox world today, again, you will see that women sometimes are the major breadwinners in their family. We're talking about from right-wing, we call black hat right-wing families. The man is home and with the kids, and he's learning in kollel or whatever, and she's the one with the professional degree, and she's the one who's the speech therapist or the occupational therapist and making the money for the family. We don't have a problem with that. It's only the secular world that's caught up and said, oh, you know what, women can get degrees and women can be a professional, and it worked out well for us. They're finally catching up with our values in that way. We don't have an issue with that. So the issue of equality for us, again, is a level of holiness. Okay. And power for us has to do with how strong we are in our religious observance. Not in religious observance, but personally how we conquer our yetzer, our evil inclination. As a matter of fact, in Ethics of the Fathers, we have the pasuk, Ezehu Gibar, who is a strong person, Hakovesh es Yitzro, the one who conquers his yetzer hara, his evil inclination. That's what strength means to us. Okay. Remember also we talked about Rachel, Yaakov's wife, and how she complained to Yaakov when she couldn't have a child. And Yaakov came down really hard on her and was very harsh with her and said, I cannot God that I can give you a child. And commentators say this is kind of harsh language to his poor wife, who just wanted to be able to fulfill a role in that God gave her, to have, bear, and raise a child. But what was Yaakov telling her? Yaakov was telling her, you have a spiritual responsibility that's equal to mine. Now, granted, God may have put aside this path of bearing and raising kids as a great special way that you can do it. But if you can't do it that way, that doesn't mean that you can't live up to your responsibility, your spiritual responsibility, in other ways. You need to still be the best you can be, as it were. You have a responsibility, a holy level that's equal to mine. And if you can't fulfill that through having children, which is the way you want it to be, then you need to still live up to that responsibility in other ways. So again, there's the issue of equality. We're equal in terms of religious responsibilities, in terms of spiritual responsibilities, not specifically per se with the commandments, but we have the same religious spiritual responsibility. Okay, so getting back to this to Minyan now. Okay, so that covers the why we're not obligated. Right. Also, there of course the basis of we're not obligated is because we're not obligated in mitzvos that are dependent on time, that are time-bound mitzvos. Right. Okay, so we're not obligated in Minyan. That's the philosophical underpinnings of that. Okay. But what about women who want to take on more mitzvahs? Don't we always say that if you want to take on a mitzvah, you can take on a mitzvah, right? Women took on the mitzvah of listening to shofar and of shaking a lulav and esrog. These are all time-bound mitzvahs that they're exempted from, but they take it on. And the Talmud says a person who takes on more mitzvahs is praiseworthy. So the woman says, fine, I understand why I am not obligated to Minyan, but why am I not allowed to join the Minyan? Right? It's still that question here. I'm not obligated. Men are obligated. Fine. Why can't I be number 10? It's frustrating for a woman who's sitting in shul at if it's 8:30 at the HOC or 9:30 at the Torah Center, and there's 9 men in the men's section, and they're waiting. They have to stop davening because they can't go further in their davening because they don't have a 10th man. It must be frustrating as a woman to sit there and think, what am I, chopped liver? Why can't I'm here? Just go ahead, right? So there's that question. Why can't they be allowed to? Okay. So the reason has to do, now we're going to get into the a concept that, again, is the halachic basis for this. We have a concept of equal obligation, which means that if I have a certain level of obligation to a mitzvah, that I can join a group that has that same level of obligation. If I'll follow me along. If I have a certain, I'll give examples and I'll show you what I mean. If I have a certain level of obligation to a commandment, then I can join a group of people who have that same level of obligation. If I don't have that obligation, that same level of obligation as other people, I can't join that group of people. The one who is not obligated to a mitzvah and one who is not obligated to a mitzvah also cannot perform it for someone else. I'll give you examples. Okay, so basically the idea is equal obligation, equal halachic status. Okay, and let me give you some easy examples that both involve men and women as well. Okay, for example, in a general way, if I'm eating bread and if you're eating bread, I can make the bracha for both of us. I have to have you in mind, you have to ask me to exempt you, and I exempt you from the mitzvah of having to do it yourself. If I'm eating bread, if you're eating bread and I'm not eating bread, I can't make the bracha for you. Why? Because I'm not obligated to bless the bread, to make the blessing on the bread. You're eating the bread and I'm not. So I can't do the mitzvah for you because we have a different level of obligation.
Like your
different status.
Can't make Kiddush.
I was just going to get to that. Yeah, hold on, yeah.
Oh, I have a very thrilling example of this with my children. Okay, so one of my sons was circumcised by a Jewish doctor. This was in the old days, who happened to be a woman. Mm-hmm. So, was it Orthodox or anyway, I don't remember, but anyway, then he went to yeshiva, and they had to, in some ways, kind of redo it. I mean,
yeah, they have ways of doing that.
Yeah, because the rabbi said, well, a woman isn't circumcised, therefore she can't circumcise. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, that's pretty
vivid. So here's another example. Okay. So Lisa brought up another example. Kiddush is another example. So both a man and a woman have an equal obligation to make Kiddush Friday night. Because they have an equal obligation, the man can make it and exempt the woman, his wife, and A woman can make it and exempt her husband. Traditionally, we don't do that. It's traditional that the head of the household makes kiddush, and I accept that. I'm not, but halachically speaking, because they have the same level of obligation to making kiddush, a woman could do it for her husband. In fact, a woman, when it comes to Shabbos, there is a mitzvah that they're both obligated to, another mitzvah they're obligated to do, and a woman does it for her husband. Anyone want to guess what I'm thinking of? Come on, guys. Lighting candles. Both a man and a woman are obligated in lighting Shabbos candles. So they have an equal level of obligation. That's why the woman can do it and exempt her husband from having to do it. She includes him in the mitzvah. Okay? A single man living on his own has to make it, but a woman, and aside from the fact that it's typically the woman's mitzvah, and there are a nice mystical and spiritual reasons for that, but aside from that, on a halachic level, she's allowed to do it for him because she has an equal obligation to the mitzvah. Now, let's go back to Kiddush for a minute. Let's say at the table there's a woman and her son, her 12-year-old son. The 12-year-old son does not have any obligations for mitzvahs. He has no halachic obligation to make Kiddush. So if there's a mother and her 12-year-old son at the Shabbos table, who needs to make Kiddush? The mother.
The kid could make it for himself if he wanted to.
Correct,
right?
but it doesn't exempt her.
her.
She cannot listen to his Kiddush and be yotze and have done the mitzvah, as it were. She didn't do the mitzvah if she listened to his Kiddush alone. She has to make it for herself. So there, again, it's not an issue of male-female. It's an issue of obligation. She has the higher obligation to the boy. Yeah.
Is that why in a group on Shabbos, someone else will say the Kiddush, because some men want to do their own Kiddush? Is that the reason?
Correct. When you have guests at the table, the head of the household is making Kiddush for everybody and can exempt everybody, including the other male guests. The other male guests may decide, I don't want to be exempted, I want to make my own Kiddush, which is fine. We give our guests that choice all the time. At my table, my father is fine with having my husband exempt him from Kiddush, even though you would think that but because they have the same level of obligation. My husband can perform the mitzvah. I shouldn't say exempt other people. It's not really the right word. It's really do the mitzvah for them, exempt them from having to do it themselves. He sort of takes on the mitzvah for everybody. Okay. So from those examples, we see that the issue is not a male and female issue. It's an issue of obligation, levels of obligation. Another example is the Hanukkah candles. Both men and women have an equal obligation in lighting Hanukkah candles. So if her husband is not home at the right time or out of town, she can do it and, again, exempt him from having to do it on his own. Okay?
Or he can for her. So
correct.
You're saying
which is why the head of the family, again, does it for her. Yeah, equal obligation, equal halachic status.
So many examples that we've talked about all different things. We talk about how women run the household. So why is the woman not considered the head of the household? My husband doesn't even know where the light bulbs are.
That's true. Certainly when it comes to, you look at this, again, go back to the poem, The Woman of Valor. Yeah. It describes a woman who is, for all intents and purposes, she runs that household. Why it has come to be traditional that the man is the one to make Kiddush and the man is the one to, really, I'm not even sure there's that many other examples that we can think about. It comes to making Kiddush, fine. Lighting Hanukkah menorah, fine. Maybe because we want children to see their fathers in some sort of
they need that.
responsible.
They
do need to. Again, remember that men are the ones to need the extra mitzvos. And again, it doesn't negate what I'm saying now about women could do it and exempt them, but. They need to have those extra mitzvahs. They need to have that extra discipline. they need to constantly be doing mitzvahs. We want to give them the opportunity as much as possible, I think. And
Well, maybe they need that honor, the way their mentality is constructed, and maybe that's not bad.
we
But,
definitely
we get to light the Shabbos candles, and we get to bear Jewish children, and they can't.
correct.
So, they need to get some honor
Right.
too
Yeah.
for their special efforts.
For sure, and we discussed that the idea of public versus the private roles, and that women are assigned a more private role in Judaism, and that men need the more public, or maybe not need, but they are assigned that role. And I think it does have to do with part of the way that they're built, as we mentioned we talked about that men were given a characteristic of kibush, aggression and conquering, and so I think that this is an area that they are allowed to use that in, just being the head in certain ways.
And to balance that out, isn't the man obligated to honor his wife more than himself?
Correct.
So
Right.
It's not an unrestrained honor or power.
It's not a power issue at all. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's a matter of it's a matter of obligating him,
Mm-hmm.
even in the family structure, of saying, you do the mitzvah, Okay, so let's get back to Minyan now. Okay, now, because Minyan is a group of men that have the same level of obligation to public prayer, right? Women who, remember, have a lesser degree of obligation in public prayer, right? Therefore, they cannot be counted in this group. Again, a person who has a lesser level of obligation to a mitzvah cannot join in a group or be part of a group or exempt someone else who has a higher level of obligation. Okay? So we don't have a mitzvah for communal prayer. So I can't discharge this mitzvah for another man. Just like in the situation I said where the woman is, she wants to be the 10th person in this anti-sexism program of the bosses. A woman, because by doing so, she's taking the place of that 10th man who will learn from that video that week. So too in a Minyan situation, if I'm going to be the 10th man, as it were, if I'm going to be the 10th person, I am now taking away the opportunity for a man to do this mitzvah, which I'm not required to do, and he is. Okay? So, no problem. Okay. By the way, okay, there are situations where, now here's where I come back to the idea that there are some situations where men cannot be counted in Minyan. Okay, you stay for this. Hold on, this is just 2 more seconds, Lisa. Number one, we kind of gave a hint to that before when we talked about the mother with her 12-year-old son. A minor boy, a boy under the age of 13, cannot be counted in a Minyan because he has no obligation to that mitzvah. Another example, the second example, and then you can go, is what's called an onain. An onain is a person whose close relative has died but has not yet been buried. That person is not obligated to any mitzvah, to any commandments. Because this man who is not obligated to any mitzvahs, he is not allowed to join a Minyan. Because, why? He doesn't have the same level of obligation to a Minyan that another man has. Therefore, he can't join that group. So it's not a man-woman thing. It's not a man-woman thing. It's a level of obligation thing. Totally different view, right? Totally different view. Okay. So now this actually brings me to one more little piece of this, and we'll finish on this, is the practical halachic source for Minyan. We discussed the philosophical underpinnings of Minyan. We didn't discuss where the rabbis figure out that the minyan has to be 10 men. Okay, which now our discussion of this is going to show us that in certain situations women are considered part of a minyan. Okay, here we go. So the Talmud talks about Kiddush Hashem, making a sanctification of God's name, and Dvarim Shebekdusha, which means holy matters. They learn that this means that there has to be a public of 10 men or 10 people from a hermeneutical rule called a Gezerah Shava. It's a hermeneutical rule we learn all the way going back to Moses, which tells us that we can sort of we can juxtapose a pasuk, a textual verse, with another one, and somehow learn a connection from some parallelism in the verses. Okay, now follow me, because I'm dealing with 3 verses. Here we go. Here's the Gezerah Shava. Okay, basically, by the way, Gezerah Shava means similar laws, similar rules, which basically means that from 2 similar situations, I'm going to learn out there's a similar rule. Okay, here we go. There's the first pasuk, the first verse from the Torah, from the Chumash says, "And I shall be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel." All right, so there's this idea that sanctifying God's name somehow has to happen in the midst of a group. All right. We're not sure exactly what that means yet. Okay. Now, the second pasuk says, there's a second verse that says, "Separate yourselves from the midst," that's the word from the first pasuk, midst of the congregation. So we had the word midst in the first pasuk, sanctifying in the midst. Now, the second pasuk says, "Separate yourselves from the midst of the congregation." So now we're learning that there is a connection between the idea of a midst, a group of people, having to do or meaning the same thing as a congregation. From the midst of a congregation. There's a connection between the word midst and congregation. And now finally, the third pasuk, which is going to bring it all together, which says this, and now this pasuk is from the incident of the spies. All right, after the whole incident, God says, "How long shall I bear with this evil congregation which murmur against me?" Right? So again, we have the first pasuk using the word midst, the second pasuk using the word midst and congregation, and the third pasuk using the word congregation. Now, the fact that here from this, the rabbis learn out the fact that the minyan, this evil congregation that is quoted in the third pasuk, refers to 10 men. Therefore, they learn out that sanctification, right, from the first pasuk, "I shall be sanctified in the midst," sanctification must occur in the midst of a congregation of 10. That's how they learn. It's a little bit of a stretch, but it's a perfectly valid hermeneutical rule of interpretation of the text. All right? You got it? So from the, again, juxtaposition of sentences, verses in the Torah, they learn out that congregation means 10 men, and congregation is where we have the idea of having to sanctify God's name. All right? So from this, because the last pasuk again referred to the 10 spies, the rabbis deduce that a minyan must contain 10 males. So when there is a davar b'kedusha, a holy matter, where we are limiting ourselves to 10 men. Now, I teased you with the idea that there are times that a woman is considered part of this congregation. And that is when we are publicizing the sanctification of God's name. Whenever we are getting together in a group to publicize, we are making a public announcement or sanctification of God's name, both in a negative way and a positive way. Women are included. I'll give you the positive ways first. Women form a minyan for the purposes of reading Megillas Esther on Purim. They can form a minyan for that. Okay, why? Because the miracle of Purim had to do with the purpose of the reading of the Megillah is to publicize the miracle of Purim, which the women, of course, were also affected by. So even though it's one of those mitzvos that rely on a time connection, a certain time of the year, right? We are required to read the Megillah actually ourselves. So therefore, in that situation, a woman is part of a minyan. Okay? Okay. Here's another example.
But it's a separate minyan.
No. I'm saying in a group of men.
Oh, wow.
I'm saying I don't mean that they gather in the same room. I'm saying they can, but I'm saying yes, if there's 9 men and 1 woman, yes, that's fine. That strictly speaking, halachically speaking, a woman can be a part of a minyan to hear Megillah.
Cool.
Yes. So again, it's not a male-female issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's a halachic issue. Now, another example is that for a bris,
mm-hmm.
a minyan is recommended, not required, but recommended,
mm-hmm.
because a bris is also in order to publicize the event. Women can be included in that in consideration of the minyan. Okay, so these are 2 examples. I'll give you 2 negative examples. Okay, and that's what I mean by negative is that when we are, God forbid, in a situation where we are doing the opposite of sanctifying God's name, we're desecrating God's name. God forbid. One example is we have a mitzvah that we should not desecrate the Sabbath. Of course, we should not violate the Shabbos. If one does so in a public,
mm-hmm.
they are subject to that's a capital offense and subject to the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
What is the definition of a public? They have to desecrate the Shabbos in a group with having at least 10 people, men or women, seeing them. And again, women are included in this minyan because it has to do with the sanctification of God's name. There is a desecration occurring at this point, unfortunately, and therefore they are included in this group. Okay. In a similar way, if there, we have a rule that says that if under threat of death, a Jew is has to sin. In other words, if someone holds a gun to my head, says, eat this cheeseburger or you'll die, I must eat the cheeseburger. Simply speaking, because God doesn't want us to die, right? For his mitzvahs, he wants us to live for the mitzvahs. We must violate, right, any mitzvah except 3, except the big 3, what we call the big 3, which is idol worship, murder, or illicit sexual behavior. But other than that, we have to sin, as it were, if our life is dependent upon it. That's in private. But if we're in public, if the person holding the gun to my head is outside, in a public of 10 Jewish people, men and women, okay, so there's a public is considered both men and women, then I have to be killed rather than violate the mitzvah, because in that case I am possibly influencing others to transgress the mitzvah as well. So different status. So there again is an example of there at stake is a sanctification, or God forbid, a desecration of God's name. And in that situation, those kind of situations, women are considered a part of the public, part on an equal status, an equal level as men.
Well, that really proves that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. From Alice Frost. That proves it. Good. Wow. I think that concludes our class today about women and minyan. And next week, I think we'll go into just a few other corollary issues to women in the shul, which would be women's prayer groups, talis, tefillin, that sort of thing, leading prayers, etc. Okay?
Can we talk about...
Thank you.